Ever wanted to draft for the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the Indigo Disk DLC, but don't know where to start? Well, this is a video for you guys. What's going on, everybody? You have Tone here, back with episode number 6 of how to draft in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I do apologize though of the delay between this episode and the previous one. Just a lot of IRL stuff came up on my end and some internet issues that are still under some revision, but for the most part I at the very least want to get something up so the series just doesn't die after 5 episodes. So if you guys missed the previous episode of the series, the link will be in the top right description of the video, where essentially we did a core focused basically around I'm trying to it's been so long I don't even remember my own doggone core, but anyway, yeah, Meowscarada, Garchomp, and Jirachi. So that was the core we did for last episode. This time though, it's a little bit less of a core, so to speak, but at the same time it's not really a mishmash of Pokemon on top of that. But before I go any further into the core itself, there is one other thing that I want to talk about a little bit, just very briefly. So usually when I put together these teams and whatnot, I always give alternative options to other mons and the like. But there is one thing that I didn't really take into consideration or didn't really talk about much in terms of drafting the team, and that basically just comes down to where the hell you draft. So obviously draft order is imperative to basically how you want to build your team, how you start it, and how you go from there. But there are going to be instances when it comes to drafting that you really want to use something like Dragapult or get one of those high-end Pokemon, but you don't really get lucky in the draft order and you're either in the middle of the draft, which is like sort of the dead zone for most people, or you're towards the back end of the draft, which in my opinion, for at the very least in my experience, I feel a lot more comfortable drafting towards the back of a draft, because while I don't get access to all the high-end Pokemon like Dragapult and the like, I do get the less options available for me, the more options I have for myself. And especially with me drafting towards the back of the draft, you get first crack on round 2, so you have your little 2-mon core going on and you're able to establish what you want to do with the rest of your team quicker than your other competition. The other thing to take into account when it comes to when you don't have access to high-end Pokemon like said Dragapult, you know at some point in time that you have to draft something to deal with said Dragapult or any other strong Pokemon, high-end round 1 Pokemon. But regardless of where you end up drafting, it's still pretty imperative to make your picks count. The last thing you want to do is end up with a giant mishmash of Pokemon on your team and you end up just disassembling your entire team at the end of the draft in like a grace period, or you just make some free agency transactions trying to make your team better, but at the end of the day your team is probably going to be worse or better depending on what ends up being dropped by other people. But at the most part, when it comes to drafting, you really want to make sure you make your picks count. So in order to really establish that your where you draft is, to establish where you end up in the draft, try to at the very least have some sort of idea what could potentially drop to you depending on your draft position, and then from there try to work out some sort of mons that can go and pair up with those Pokemon. Now the Pokemon that I've done in the past, these cores, I've always done them under the assumption that you're not going to get sniped and they will be available. But in hindsight, that won't be the case all the time. Most of the time other people will have the same idea as you, and other people will see Pokemon that may be priced lower than expected, and they will try to prioritize that Pokemon a little bit earlier than you would like, especially when it tries to fit into your plans. You get sniped and then you start fumbling for backup. The last thing you want to do is end up in a situation where you're fumbling and you don't know what to pick and you just take some random Pokemon and it really just throws you off, like, oh, I have this, but I drafted this before, now I'm just stuck with 2 Pokemon such doing the exact same thing. that's a waste of a pick, and yeah, you're scrambling to see what you can do and make up for whatever you lost, and it just like starts to spiral out of control. So the one thing to try to do, like I always do with these videos, is to always try to ensure that you have some sort of backup plan, a plan B, or in other cases a plan C, or if worse comes to worse, a plan D. Granted, that sort of situation more or less won't come up, especially if you make yourself aware of what other people have taken ahead of you. If you see your opponent, if you see one of your other coaches has a typing that you're lacking, but they have, chances are they're not going to double up on that typing, and you can make yourself a little bit more of a riskier person and prioritize taking that mon or that typing around later, because you know that that the other people ahead of you won't take that mon, and on the way back you feel a lot better because you got one mon that you needed. You come back and it's your pick again, you get the other type that you really needed, like say a ghost type or whatever the case may be. It doesn't really matter what the typing is, but as long as you know that you can get said mon later on because the other people ahead of you won't take it because they already have another Pokemon on their draft that fulfills the need or the role that you're looking for in your draft. Now, in hindsight, the role per se is a little bit more of a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a bit more strenuous and a bit more, it's not really vague, but the roles, it really just varies by your need, it varies by the typing, it varies by role compression, all that sort of stuff. And really, when it comes to drafting, the best thing to have in a good draft, regardless of the order, is to have at least a few Pokemon that can essentially take on multitudes of roles at any given time. You never really want to you can make a very solid draft with a bunch of Pokemon that are really deemed as one-dimensional, and I put that in quotation marks because most Pokemon aren't really deemed as a mon that does one thing and one thing well, but you really want to balance out the ability to bring Pokemon that have more than one specific niche, especially if you're trying to differentiate between a standard small gun format and a draft league format where literally anything is possible depending on what you end up drafting. So the thing to take into account when it comes to the order, regardless of whether you're the first pick, the last pick, or somewhere in the middle, you really want to make sure to make your picks count and really make yourself aware of the other people ahead of you. Or in the grand scheme of things, try to prioritize mons depending on what your opponent may lack. Again, if you see something that you want, but you know that you'll be able to get it around later because other people ahead of you have said mon or said typing that already have something that fits the role they have that you don't have, you can prioritize getting another Pokemon that can throw off your opponent and benefit you, so it's an easy 2-for-1 scenario, and it just makes drafting so much better, and it really just makes it so that your team becomes a lot more functionable, and it really throws off your opponent, especially in the sense of making things easier for you, difficult for them, and if you end up playing them in said matchup in your draft league, then that's an advantage to you. So really be mindful of not only your own draft and needs, but it also pay very close attention to all the other people in your draft. Because as the old saying goes, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You may be friends in the draft league scenario, but when it comes to drafting Pokemon, everyone is after you. Even if you collab with other people and promise not to snipe them, eventually you might have to play them, and that's a whole different story altogether. But the main concept to take into account with this little tidbit of information is try to prioritize not only what you're lacking, but see what other people around you, ahead of you, are lacking, and try to throw them off and make them reach a bit more for other things that you already have, and just try to make things a little bit more difficult for them and make it more advantageous for you. it's a bit more vague talking about it while actually putting an example into play, but basically it just comes down to experience and just try to play around with other potential game plans when it comes to drafting Pokemon. If you really have your eyes set on one particular Pokemon that you feel comfortable using and you want to try to build with that Pokemon in mind, try to prioritize getting those particular Pokemon in general. There will be some examples that I will address with this core in particular, because this core for this episode is a bit more, the word I'm looking for is interchangeable for the most part. Mostly not the first Pokemon, but more so the last two. And I'll get to that when we get into the draft itself. But with that being said, on to the core for this episode. So for episode 6 here, this is not really much of a core per se. It's not really a synergistic sort of thing, but they do have their own real niches, and it has a nice little balance of roles to fulfill in this draft. So for this week, we have the core of Tornadus-T, Gouging, Fire, and Manaphy. Now you're looking at this core and you're like, this isn't really a core. There's no real synergistic value going on here. But for the most part, it kind of does work itself out in the sense that you have a Pokemon like Tornadus-T, which is normally a round 1 Pokemon. It just mainly depends on whether or not your draft league allows terrestrialization on higher tier Pokemon. Tornadus-T does have a good niche as being a good Terra Captain, especially in conjunction with being a good offensive and defensive mon. Regenerates one of the best defensive abilities in the game, recovering a third of HP upon switch out, and it has a multitude of sets between being a pivot, it's a good knockoff mon, it's a good momentum with U-turn, nasty plot is always a good option for a sweeper, for a setup sweeper, and then you have these other two Pokemon surrounding it, Gouging, Fire, and Manaphy. Gouging Fire is one of those Pokemon that's really interesting, especially considering that from a small gun perspective, it's currently being suspect tested in OU at the time of me making this video. But in draft, it's a sort of a mixed bag as far as I'm concerned here. Like, on one hand, it's very potent, fantastic typing in Dragon plus Fire, having Dragon Dance, has recovery, and overall, it's a very solid mon with very solid bulk, decent stats, and the like. But there is the main conception that it is thrown back by photosynthesis. Is still good, but with photosynthesis, if you don't draft a Sunsetter, so basically either Torkoal or Ninetales, you cannot trigger photosynthesis without having booster energy on your Gouging Fire. And if you're running booster energy, that means you're not running heavy duty boots, and if you're not boots, you're taking entry hazard damage, especially considering this mon's weak to Stealth Rock. So it really has its pros and cons in that sense. And then with Manaphy, it's really difficult to describe Manaphy in Gen 9, because basically way back in Generation 6, Manaphy was one of the most devastating Pokemon in Draft League format because of the ability to Tail Glow and just decimate opposing teams. The main problem now with Manaphy now, despite the fact that they're getting access to, of course, with the brand new, its new signature move in Take Heart, which is essentially just Calm Mind and Refresh in one move, the main problem with Manaphy is now, while 100 stats across the board is fantastic, it has good mix of offensive and defensive, it does have two cons. One, it needs to set up in order to do damage. 100 base special attack right off the bat is not really all that powerful. That's one problem. The other problem is 100 base speed is not good in this generation of Draft League format, as opposed to like Generation 6, where 100 base speed was really good. In hindsight though, the core itself is very interchangeable. Not so for Torn. The other two Pokemon are easily interchangeable because it doesn't have to be Manaphy. The main reason that I put Manaphy on this particular team as opposed to using another water type Pokemon in general, it basically just comes down to what the role I wanted to fill. And the main thing I wanted to fill is Manaphy can still function as a wall breaker, despite the fact that it needs to have setup options to set up first to actually do any significant damage. The other good thing about Manaphy, it has the ability to be a wall breaker and a bulky water all in one slot. So again, roll compression. And on top of that, Manaphy doesn't need to be the Tail Glow Sweeper all the time, which does benefit its good defensive typing being a pure water type. And on top of that, hydration isn't a bad ability at all, especially if you're running in conjunction with Rain Dance and Rest. However, in this sense, since I'm using the SBO Draft League Tiers draft board for this series, they have Take Heart banned. So in this case, you really have to utilize Rain Dance plus Rest if you really want to make the most out of hydration. But nonetheless, though, Manaphy can still function very, very well as a decent stall breaker against those more pesky defensive cores. And it works really well with Gouging Fire, especially considering that there are some Pokemon that Gouging Fire can struggle with, mainly like some particular rock-type Pokemon that can struggle to break past it, like offensively, stuff like Lycanroc Dust can offensively check it with Accelerock. Manaphy, while it doesn't resist rock, is bulky enough to take those hits if you EV it properly. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into the rules and roles. As always, nothing has really changed from the last few episodes. For the most part, everything else here I've talked about pretty extensively over the last few episodes, but for the most part, the ideas are still pretty much set in stone. The only thing that I really didn't add between the last time and the other time that I didn't really bring up, so for a team like this, you still have your strong priority. While we don't have the priority yet, we will address that as the draft progresses. At least 2 Stealth Rockers, we don't have any at the moment, so we will address that as well. Spikes and Toxic Spikes, ideally you want to have the ability to have the option to get additional entry hazard damage on your opponent, as well as Toxic Spikes, especially if your opponent is lacking Grounded Poison type, which is pretty important to not automatically lose to Toxic Spikes or mostly Grounded Poison types in general. One Hazard Remover, granted, or Core Change if you have Cinderace, but just having at least one should do the trick just fine. Tornadus does not get defog, if I recall correctly, so having a means of getting rid of hazards, especially on a team like this with a mon like Gouging Fire, you really want to have the option. If you want to run Booster Energy, you would at least want to have one form of removal to ensure that Gouging Fire is taking hazard damage for no reason. You're not forced to click Morning Sun when you don't want to, so ideally stuff like that is very beneficial for this draft. At least two Pokemon above base 110 speed or 110, just to have something to at the very least threaten and speed tie with opposing Lotties. We already have one Pokemon with Torn-T, so we will address the other at least one of the Pokemon that does fit that role. One Wall Breaker, I already talked about it. Manaphy can functionally be a Wall Breaker. Choice Banded Gouging Fire is a thing that can essentially break like grass type Pokemon from Manaphy, make things easier for it to spam Water Stab. Granted, we also have Torn that deals with grass types as well from Manaphy, so regardless, that sort of combination there does work. But obviously, if you're running the more offensive role, you definitely want to prioritize trying to get some removal for Gouging Fire and take unnecessary damage aside from Flare Blitz. So there is that. One Ground Immunity, we have Torn, but ideally you like to get at least something else that at the very least resists ground on top of that to not overwhelm Torn as the immediate ground immunity. So something like Levitate would definitely work as well. One electric immunity. We have 2 Pokemon on this team weak to electricity. Gouging Fire may resist it, but it doesn't block Volt Switch, so we definitely want to address that. One Bulky Water. We have Manaphy on this team, so the Bulky Water role has been addressed very well. Grounded Poison type, I already talked about that and mentioned with the Tyson and Toxic Spikes. You don't want to auto lose to a team with Toxic Spikes that goes up and you have no way of getting rid of them, and you don't want to really just be forced to run heavy duty boots on everything. At least one knockoff user. Like I said before, item removal is very, very imperative to messing up your opponent's strategy. Luckily, we do have Torn-T with access to knockoff. Manaphy, if I remember correctly, also gets access to knockoff. So we have some extra 2 mons with item removal. Normally, you won't see knockoff ran on Manaphy. The option is there, although the odds of you actually bringing it is rather scarce, but you could surprise someone and make it more of a utility set, especially considering that Manaphy also gets other good stuff like U-turn for momentum. So something like that is definitely very, very nice to have. A fast taunt and encore user. We have Torn in that role, obviously, for taunt to dissuade setup, to prevent recovery or hazards going up on our side. So having something like that, very, very nice to have for this team. And the Fire, Water, Grass, Dragon Steel, Fairy Core is still in effect. Granted, we didn't really fulfill those roles as of yet, but as the draft progresses, we will fulfill those roles as we go along. And the last thing I want to mention that's not on the screen, since we're having the option of having spikes and toxic spikes, obviously you want to have a ghost type at the very least, just to prevent opposing Pokemon from clicking Rapid Spin to spin those hazards away. It's not really good if you go through all the trouble to hashtag your opponent and they click Rapid Spin and removes all your hazards. At the very least, and the other thing that's not on this list also is the importance of having a Dark type, just for the have the Psychic immunity. Granted, normally you would get your Steel to deal with Psychic, but unless your Steel type also is immune to Psychic, like King Gambit, Bisharp, whatever the case may be, ideally you want to have at least a Dark type Pokemon in general, just for have that Psychic immunity. And of course, most Dark type Pokemon do have access to knockoff. So having item removal on top of stab is also very, very nice to have. It's not really thought about much in the grand scheme of things, but it's still pretty good to have, all things considered. So with that being said, let's head on to the team finally. So here we are, guys, with our draft with Torn-T, Gouging Fire, and Manaphy. So first off, thank you again to the SPL, Shadow King and PokemonMD for letting me use the SPL draft doc for this episode. So we're going here under the assumption Torn-T, Gouging Fire, and Manaphy are going to get drafted to us. No questions asked, no snipes. However, before I go any further, I talked about Torn-T. Well, Torn-T definitely feels like a round 1 Pokemon. Gouging Fire and Manaphy, though, I will go on the record and say this before I get started. Gouging Fire is definitely going to be seen as a round 1 Pokemon. And the reason I say this, it basically comes down to 3 words. And those 3 words are New Toy Syndrome. So basically, New Toy Syndrome is basically you want to have the Pokemon, the new shiny mon that comes out by Game Freak all the time, and you're like, oh, Gouging Fire, Iron Boulder, and the like. I want to use that Pokemon, so I'm going to take it round 1. I'll tell you right now, the odds of you actually getting this core is honestly pretty slim. I'm going to keep it a stack with you guys. It's very slim because of the still New Toy Syndrome going around, and with Gouging Fire still being seen as a round 1 Pokemon. Somehow, by the power of God, if you get Gouging Fire Torn-T, good on you. I'm telling you that from now. Good on you. However, there is an alternative to Gouging Fire. I already talked about it. That Pokemon is Cinderace. It doesn't have the same Dragon Dancing potential, but Cinderace still has its uses. It gives you 2 Pokemon faster than 110. That's 1. 2. It does get Swords Dance this generation. That's great. So that's 2. 3. Has a removal with Core Change. Great. Still has utility. Still has U-turn. Can taunt. So yeah. If you don't get Gouging Fire with Torn-T, Cinderace is an option as an alternative. Then we have Manaphy. Manaphy is, like I talked about, it's not as good as it was in past generations. It's still very, very good. The problem is, the metagame has basically sped up to the point where Manaphy is definitely seen as a lesser mon by some people. Like, people will still draft it early, but at the same time, if the recent SPL season, it was taken round 9 or round 10. I don't remember what round it was taken, but it was definitely super late. And I've seen drafts where Manaphy haven't been taken at all. So, on that note, this does not have to be Manaphy in this slot. It can be any bulky water that sort of fits the role of Manaphy. It doesn't have to necessarily be a setup sweeper and a breaker, but there are other options for Manaphy. Examples: Quaquaval would work as a bulky as the slot here for Manaphy. Going down the line, Suicune also works. Not round 3, but it's still a bulky water that can definitely work with this draft. Azumarill also works. Primarina also works. So yeah, you have roughly 5 options there. More, because there is plenty of water to get in the draft that easily can make up for you not taking Manaphy and still getting good value from your bulky water. There are plenty of options to consider over the Manaphy slot. Don't be afraid to change it up. I won't stop you. Everyone has their own opinion on what they want to draft. But for all intents and purposes, we are just using this core. So, that being said, let's jump into the team itself. So, we have our Tornadus-T, Gouging, Fire, Manaphy core. Altogether, that's 51 points. So we have 69 points left for 8 more Pokemon. So let's get started. So the next 2 picks are actually going to be pretty interchangeable. Most people will prefer, it more so depends on personal preference with these next 2 slots here. So round 4, once again we see Glimmora here, but basically the main thing with Glimmora, it's roll compression. You want a Stealth Rocker, you have a Spiker, Toxic Spikes with Toxic Debris, very good special attacker, Mortal Spin for hazard removal, and a Grounded Poison. So yeah, a bunch of rolls, check the boxes off of a bunch of rolls there for this team. We didn't have rocks, we didn't have hazards in general, we didn't have removal. Right away, we have Glimmora that does all of that for us and makes the team a bit more offensive in nature, because Glimmora is definitely one of the best hazard setters in Draft League format, and it fits a bunch of roles that we did not have for the draft. Round 5 though, we wanted to address getting a steal, because having a steal I felt was very important, especially the earlier you get your steal, I feel the better. So round 5 for this particular draft, I put so for round number 5, we have Metagross on the draft. So like I said, these 2 are a little bit interchangeable, more so depends on what you prefer. But basically Metagross gives us another Stealth Rocker, it gives us priority with Bullet Punch, a Steel and Psychic type Pokemon, so you have your means of a Ice Resist, a Psychic Resist, multitudes of Resist, a Fairy Resist to go along with Glimmora. But for the most part, Metagross is just fantastic, because not only does it give us another form of hazards with Stealth Rock, it gives us a 3rd knockoff user. If you don't want to exclude Manaphy, then that's fine. But on top of that, it also provides a team with some much needed priority. With Bullet Punch, makes it easier to revenge kill stuff. Before I go any further, just quickly run down the alternative options. Glimmora can basically be any grounded poison, so something like Clodsire for a bit more of a defensive hazard setter that can still set up rocks, set up spikes, be a grounded poison, all that stuff, but it does give you an electric immunity on top of that. Going down the line of like grounded poisons, there's like Alolan Muck. There's, if you want to keep the rock typing, like in Rock Dust, be a bit more offensive in nature. And then for Metagross, the alternative for that would essentially be something like Scizor. If it makes it past round 3 and you want to grab it round 4, then Scizor would definitely work, especially considering you keep your priority with Bullet Punch, but you also get momentum in the process with U-Turn. So basically this comes down to whether or not you prefer having momentum with your priority or Stealth Rock with your priority. And it also does have the different weaknesses, of course, with Scizor only being 4 with the fire. Metagross, I just felt a little bit more comfortable with, because it does have a bit more bulk on the special side, so you could be a bit more diverse if you want to with Metagross's set. Then we get to round number 6. Round 6 is a bit more of an it's a poor preference pick, so to speak, but it does fit the role for Gouging Fire specifically, especially if you don't want to run heavy duty boots all the time and you want to run like Banded or Boost Your Energy. So this helps out a bit more with the hazard removal option here. So round 6, we're doubling up on our typings already, and we have Hatterene. Now I've never put Hatterene on this team, but Hatterene works really well, Considering the fact that Magic Bounce is really good to prevent hazards, obviously stuff like Mold Break or Excadrill is a thing, and even more so, even lower down, we have Mycelium Mite Toadscrew, which can spore and set up spikes and bypass Magic Bounce altogether. But Hatterene still works here as a sort of hazard deterrent, and the team itself was already really fast as it is, with the slowest Pokemon being Metagross. I wanted to have a sort of slow option in this sense. Hatterene does work here to prevent, at the very least, prevent most hazards from going up for Gouging Fire's sake. You get momentum with Baton Pass, you get Healing Wish to heal up your other Pokemon, and you get the option of being offensive with Trick Room. So you have that sort of option there, and a multitude of variety, and you can also do like Calm Mind and the like. Nuzzle for speed control, which helps out Manaphy. So it works out really well in that sense, which is why we have Hatterene here for round 6. Alternatively, there are other options for Hatterene. There is Gardevoir, just for similar typing, but obviously it's not really all that, it's a bit too fast. I like Hatterene here just for the Trick Room option to make the team a little bit more balanced in nature from a speed tier perspective. And then of course another option you can consider is also Screamtail, which is essentially just the three Psychic Fairy types. But Screamtail does provide you with a lot more, with a bunch of utility, gives you another Stealth Rocker, gives you Wish support, and a multitude of other options like Encore and whatnot. It can be a very annoying mon in general. And then of course the last one is a bit more defensive for a pure fairy type. There's Sylveon, there's also Florges. Both provide you with the wish passer sort of role here to be a bit more defensive in nature. And on top of that, they are a bit more, they still give you some offensive potential like Calm Mind, Baton Pass, and all that stuff. So yeah, you definitely have your options here for an alternative to Hatterene, but again, Hatterene just works really well here because of like trying to make the team a bit more balanced from a speed tier perspective. You don't want to be too fast for a draft. So then moving on, round number 7. So for round number 7 here, we have Pawmot, which a Pokemon that really fell off since the beginning of, well, I guess home meta, or even pre-home for the most part. At the beginning, Pawmot was like really good, although it was mainly due to the fact of when Revival Blessing was allowed in most leagues, and I still feel like Revival Blessing is probably like one of the greatest mistakes in Pokemon history. When a Pokemon faints, it should stay fainted. I am not dealing with a 7v6 matchup. I refuse. Well, I can't refuse. That already happened to me twice, but that's a different story. But Pawmot, Revival Blessing being banned aside, works here for a multitude of reasons. I'm sorry about that. But the reasoning for Pawmot here is a few things. One, good speed tier, base 105, having something between Manaphy and Torn is really good. That's one. Two, Volt Absorb. So we have an electric immunity, which we didn't currently have, which helps out Torn, helps out Manaphy, but we will address that later on, actually with the next round pick. But we have Volt Absorb. Iron Fist is also really good in conjunction with stuff like Ice Punch, Mach Punch, so we have a second priority mon, so we have a good revenge killer. Electric and Fighting is also a really unique typing. Obviously, an alternative to Pawmot, if it's available, Iron Hands. You can't go wrong with that. But basically, the idea with Pawmot over Iron Hands is just to have something that at least fills the speed tier, the gap between Manaphy and Torn. And having a Pokemon like Pawmot being faster than something like, say, Garchomp is also really good. Threatening it with an Ice Punch, forcing to reveal whether or not it's like Yachi Berry or like Scarf or whatever the case may be, is a bit more beneficial for this team in general. And of course, even having stuff like Volt Switch for momentum is also really nice to have. But for the aforementioned reasons, that's why we have Pawmot on the draft. It's good speed tier at 105. Nice abilities with Volt Absorb for the electric immunity, Iron Fist to boost the power of its punching moves, and Mach Punch for a extra priority. Then we're getting to the real value picks of the draft. So round 8, we have Golurk, which a very solid value pick for 7 points, giving our team a third Stealth Rocker, giving us an electric immunity with being part ground, and giving us a rapid spin blocker being a ghost type. But for the most part, Golurk is it's pretty solid for 7. You don't really think of it much as a potential stealth rocker, but it also does get access to other cool moves, so like no guard poltergeist, no guard dynamic punch, other iron fist mons, so like drain punch, ice punch. So it has really good utility on top of that. Obviously the alternative to Golurk would definitely be Palossand. They both do the exact same thing. The main difference, obviously, aside from Palossand being a special attacker and Golurk being physical, Palossand is also 2 points cheaper at only being 5 points. So if you value having a electric immunity, it basically is coming out of personal preference whether you want a hard-hitting attacker or you want a more sturdier defensive stealth rocker with the ability of having recovery with shore up, then by all means you can definitely go that route. But for the most part here, I just went with Golurk. It just felt a bit more hard-hitting as opposed to Palossand. But if you want to do Palossand, then that's perfectly fine. There's no real wrong answer in this situation. But I just went for Golurk for a bit more of a hard-hitting attacker for the most part. The only downside to Golurk is, for the most part, I would have loved it a lot more, but unfortunately it lost rock polish this generation, so yeah, that's probably the only thing that sucks about it, but it's still a good value pick for 7. I can still make a decent Terra Captain, but from a Terra Captain perspective, it's actually the last few Pokemon can also benefit being a potential Terra nomination, which I'll get into right now. So we only have 14 points left for 3 more Pokemon, and this next pick is actually going to address some multitude of roles and help out Manaphy even further. So round 9, we have Vikavolt as our round 9 selection here. So the one thing that I did mention before about Manaphy was that 100 base speed was really terrible in this generation of draft format. The one thing to fix said speed tier is to threaten your opponent with the option of Sticky Web. And that's what makes Vikavolt so good here for 6. I don't know why it's 6, but regardless. The only real downside to Vikavolt now as opposed to previous generations is it doesn't have Roost anymore. But putting the lack of recovery aside though, the option of Sticky Web on a team like this is so beneficial because Manaphy and Gouging Fire's one of its main flaws for both of them is they're really overwhelmed and can be outsped by faster threats. So you're talking about Iron Valley, you're talking about Roaring Moon, you're talking about the Lotties, well not really the Lotties because they're levitating, but basically faster Pokemon that touches the ground are problematic for those Pokemon, especially if they're not boots. If you can put the fear of you potentially bringing Sticky Web into a matchup and force them to prioritize getting rid of said hazards or said webs, and they can't do that, that makes Manaphy and Gouging Fire that much more of a threat. You don't have to bring webs every single time, but the threat of Vikavolt being able to set them is very imperative, especially considering into the fact that you have the Magic Bounce user on top of it in Hatterene. So and on top of that, there's also the fact of Trick Room in conjunction with a Pokemon like Vikavolt, which is hard hitting, base 145 special attack, and very slow 43 speed. That's another thing to take into consideration. Alternatively, alternative to Vikavolt, apologies for that. If you don't want Vikavolt, alternatively you could get something like Araquanid if you want to keep the webs roll. Some other lower tier stuff, even like Leavanny or dare I say Spite-Ups, but basically the other nice thing about Vikavolt is it also has Levitate, so we have another ground immunity, sans Mold Breaker, but regardless we do have that ground resist in the back, and Vikavolt is just really good in general for this team, specifically for having the webs, a hard-hitting special attacker, and more importantly a slow pivot on top of Hatterene with Baton Pass and the like. Now we get to the last 2 Pokemon. We only have 8 points left, 2 Mons left, and there is one glaring weakness with this team. And I brought it up the Pokemon before, but you look at this entire draft, you look at Dragapult, you look at the Shadow Ball switch-ins, I don't see one. We don't have one. We need to fix that. We are going to fix that. Round 10. You're going to love this one, Joey, if you watch this. Yeah, we're getting Arboliva with this team. And Arboliva actually fits perfectly for this team for multitudes of reasons. First off, we have a Ghost immunity. Part normal. We have a normal type. That's 1. 2. Grass type. Ground resist. 2. 3. Grassy terrain support. Having the ability to set grassy terrain to make Gouging Fire take less damage on Earthquake, boost Manaphy if it runs Energy Ball, boost Glamora if it runs Energy Ball, and overall, hard-hitting special attacker, annoying as hell with moves like Strength Sap, Leech Seed for additional HP recovery for itself and the rest of the team, and overall, it's a fantastic value mon for this draft for the aforementioned reasons. We lack the Ghost switch-in, a Shadow Ball switch-in, Ghost Resist, and Arboliva fits that role. For all the aforementioned reasons, it's fantastic. It's 4 points. I don't know why it's 4 points, but regardless, it is fantastic. It is. I know I'm hyping it up a lot, but regardless, Arboliva is fantastic for this team. Basically, just for being a Ghost immunity, Grass typing. So you have your Ghost immunity, you have your Ground Resist, annoying Pokemon with Strength Sap to keep itself healthy, Leech Seed support for the rest of the team for additional recovery on top of that, but more importantly, Grassy Terrain support to help out Gouging Fire, which is pretty solid in general. Granted, Gouging Fire could run Earthquake as well, which can hinder it a bit. It can weaken the damage, obviously, and of course it also affects Skullwork, so if you want to get Palossand with Arboliva, that's also fine, since Earth Power is not affected, it's not weakened by Grassy Terrain, and you get extra HP recovery on top of that, so who says no to that? So basically, any alternatives to Arboliva is essentially just going to be like the main thing here with a team like this, you would ideally want to get a normal type. It would be taken at this point. So earlier on, you could probably go for like the Dunsparce. Granted, it will give you another rocker. It also gives you additional speed control with Glare, which helps out Manaphy, helps out Gouging Fire. There's not really much else to consider in terms of like having a bulky ground that also provides support. Arboliva ideally would be the best option for this draft, just for having additional support aside from the Ghost immunity. But on top of that, there's also, if you could try to get the Dunsparce with the rest of this team, that also does work. You would have to like fix the points a little bit to make the rest of the team work out a little bit better. And then round number 11, we do have Alolan Persian for 4 points, and the main reasoning for that is obviously the team didn't have a Dark type. And while Alolan Persian isn't really the most ideal Dark type for most people's perspective, on a team like this, it actually works out very, very well. First off, 115 speed. We have our second Mon faster than 110, so we actually have something that potentially threatens stuff like the Lotties. 2. Parting Shot support. So Parting Shot into a potential Nasty Plot Torn, Dragon Dance Gouging Fire, Tail Glow Manaphy, Meteor Beam, Power Meteor Beam Rock Polish Glamora, Trick Room Hatterene. You have options. You have support for your setup sweepers. And even itself, Alolan Persian can actually Nasty Plot itself. Granted, it won't really be the one doing any potential damage unless you make it like a Terra Captain or whatever. But it can Nasty Plot if you want to. But it can also taunt. It can additional knockoff support, foul play. Fur Coat's great from taking less damage from physical attackers. Momentum with U-turns. So yeah, it has a bunch of utility options at its disposal, and it really fits the team really, really well in the long run. So with that being said, there's no real alternative I can really say for Alolan Persian. The only real thing I can really think of would be like Sneasel. It fits the same speed tier at 115 speed. It's a little bit less defensive in nature, but if you want a more offensive Dark type, Sneasel is an option. at the very least you still threaten like the Lotties and whatnot. You have additional priority with Ice Shard. More, you keep your knockoff support on top of that. So yeah, Sneeze was an okay option, and if you really want to go lesser, a bit further down the list of dark type Pokemon, the main one that just comes to mind is like maybe like I want to say Sableye in a lesser sense, just for prankster support. Or if you really want to go really low on the totem pole, you're talking about like, and you still want to keep like some sort of parting shot momentum and additional support, there's also like a low point Morgrem. And I only say Morgrem in the sense of dual screens, keeping parting shot, and like it just being more of a support mon. But ideally, Alolan Persian does have a bit more synergistic value with the other top tier mons that we have at the top tier mons on the draft already. So you really want to support that as best as possible, and Alolan Persian was the best fit for those reasons in general. So with that being said, this is episode 6 on how to draft in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will try to get back on track with these videos as soon as possible. Ideally, IRL has just been kicking my butt these last few days, and it's just been really tough to actually like sit down and record this stuff. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, drop a comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm still hoping at the very least to try to hit 1,000 by the end of the year. I will try to pump out these videos a bit more frequently though, just to keep you guys excited, up to date, and to keep this series going. It's definitely been a lot of fun putting this team together. All the teams have been really fun to put together. And let me guys know what else you want me to go in depth with in terms of drafting or specific roles. I'm really trying to just help the community out as best as I possibly can, and your support definitely means a lot to me. I'm really glad that you guys enjoy these videos, and I'm looking to keep doing them for you guys. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and until the next time, this is Tone signing off for now. Peace out.